There was once a young monk who carried within his heart a quiet storm. While his robes were simple and his path seemed calm, inside he was restless, yearning to rise higher and faster than anyone around him. Each morning he woke with the thought of surpassing others, of becoming the wisest, the most respected, the most admired. Yet the more he reached, the more peace slipped through his fingers, and the more the nights turned heavy with sleepless longing. This story invites you to step into his journey, to walk with him through ambitions, fire, and into the cool waters of release. As you listen, you may notice your own body softening, your breath settling, and the weight of your own worries slowly loosening their hold. The tale is not about triumph in the way the world often praises, but about the gentle victory of surrender, where joy flows naturally and the heart finally rests. Allow these words to carry you deeper into stillness, reminding you that peace is never found by chasing, but by letting go. And if this story brings you comfort tonight, know that there are many more waiting to soothe you. Subscribe to Buddhism for sleep, and together we will continue to explore the timeless wisdom of letting go, one gentle tale at a time. In the quiet valleys of an ancient land, where the mountains stood tall like timeless guardians and the rivers sang their eternal lullabies, there lived a young monk who had only recently taken the vows of renunciation. His head was newly shaven, his robe simple and plain. Yet beneath the surface of this humble appearance burned a restless flame. He was unlike many of his brothers in the monastery who found joy in sweeping the courtyards, chanting the sutras, or sitting in still meditation. Instead, his heart throbbed with an insistent whisper, a desire that told him he must rise above. He must achieve something greater, something brighter, something that would make his name remembered long after the lamps of the temple had gone dark. Each morning, as the bell rang and the monks gathered for recitation, he watched them with eyes not of serenity but of comparison. His thoughts wandered, asking why he should remain equal when he believed he could be more. As the chants echoed through the hall, he recited the words, yet his mind painted visions of being praised by teachers, honored by kings, spoken of in faraway lands as the monk who mastered wisdom faster than all others. The very vows he had taken to release desire were tangled in a new form of craving, not for wealth or possessions, but for greatness, for recognition, for superiority. The older monks often reminded him that the path was not to be rushed, that enlightenment was not a prize to be seized, but a flower that bloomed naturally in its own season. Yet when they spoke, his heart stirred with impatience. He bowed respectfully, but inside he thought, "They are slow. They are content with so little, but I shall go further, I shall go faster." And so his days were filled not with ease, but with striving. He would wake before dawn, sitting alone under the lantern light, forcing his breath into unnatural stillness, straining to empty his mind of thoughts, yet only filling it with effort. When others rested, he pressed on, convinced that a double portion of meditation would bring him twice the fruit. When others ate simply and contentedly, he scolded himself for weakness, denying even what little comfort the monastery allowed, believing that harshness would carry him more swiftly to the goal. Yet the more he pushed, the heavier his spirit became. Nights stretched long, his body weary but his mind unable to rest. Ambition had wrapped itself around him like a chain, and though he had left behind the world's attachments, he had not freed himself from the deepest attachment of all, the craving to become. Still, he clung to it, telling himself that the others were blind, that the teachers did not see his potential, that only he knew the fire within his heart. And in this fire, he began to burn, not with light, but with exhaustion. The temple garden, which once seemed filled with fragrance and birdsong, now felt dull to him, for his eyes were fixed only on the heights he wished to reach. The laughter of novices as they carried water from the well sounded foolish to him, for he had no time for such simple joy. Every smile, every word of kindness seemed to him a distraction, an obstacle keeping him from the glory he imagined. The seasons turned, the rains came and went. The sun painted the sky in gold and crimson, but he scarcely noticed, for his mind was always racing ahead, never resting in the moment. The abbot of the monastery, a gentle elder with a face lined by years of compassion, watched him with silent understanding. He did not scold, nor did he praise, for he knew that a lesson written by experience lasts longer than one written by words. And so the young monk was left to chase his ambition, to run after it until his own breath taught him the truth. One evening, as the monastery grew still and the lanterns flickered in the twilight, the young monk sat once more in meditation. He forced his mind to be silent, but thoughts thundered like drums. He commanded his heart to be still, but it raced with pride and longing. Sweat gathered on his brow, his body trembled with effort, and yet peace eluded him like a shadow slipping away. Frustration welled up, a sharp ache in his chest, and he thought to himself, "Why does it not come? Why, after all my striving, do I not feel the bliss the masters speak of?" In that moment, he heard faint laughter outside, the voices of children from the nearby village playing by the monastery walls. Their laughter was light, their joy effortless, flowing like water. For an instant, he felt a pang of envy. How could it be that those children, knowing nothing of sutras or meditation, seemed to possess a joy that his endless efforts could not bring? The thought struck him deeply, but pride quickly covered it, whispering, "They are ignorant, their joy is shallow, mine will be eternal once I reach it." Yet even as he reassured himself, his body felt heavy, his eyes tired, and when he lay down to rest, sleep refused him. He turned from side to side, listening to the rustle of the wind, the chirping of insects, the breathing of his fellow monks, all deep in peaceful slumber, while he remained bound by the chains of desire. Night after night it was the same. He began to dread the evenings, for with darkness came the mirror of his own unrest. Though he hid it well during the day, offering polite bows and dutiful chants, inside he was unraveling, torn between the image of greatness he longed for and the emptiness it brought him. His journey had only just begun, yet already he stood at a crossroads, unaware that every step deeper into ambition was also a step further from peace. And so part one closes with the young monk lying awake under the starlit sky, his mind restless, his heart burdened, unaware that the very thing he sought most desperately could only be found by letting go of the very ambition that kept him awake. The dawn broke gently over the monastery, spilling light across the tiled roofs and waking the birds in their nests. Yet for the young monk the morning brought no ease, for he had scarcely slept through the night. Still, he rose before the bell, driven not by serenity, but by the sharp whisper of ambition that urged him onward. While others walked calmly to the meditation hall, he hurried, as if speed alone could carry him closer to the truth. He sat with his legs folded, spine rigid, and clenched his jaw as though determination could still the flowing stream of thoughts. The chants began, soft and melodic, yet he barely heard them, for inside he measured his progress, compared his breath to that of the monk beside him, judged his own concentration by how motionless his body appeared. And though he believed himself devoted, what filled him was not devotion but the constant hunger to excel, to stand above. In the kitchens he worked with the same restlessness, chopping vegetables with hurried strokes, carrying pots with a stiffness that betrayed his inner fire. The other novices shared laughter while sweeping the courtyard, but his broom moved without rhythm, his eyes darting to see if the elder monks noticed his diligence. Every act became a performance in his own mind, not an offering to the present moment, but a step in a race toward an imagined finish line. In those early days of training, he discovered the weight of discipline, yet he twisted it into another form of ambition, believing that more effort, harsher rules, greater denial of comfort would crown him with wisdom. And so he began to fast beyond what was asked, denying himself bowls of rice until his body weakened. His steps grew unsteady, yet he mistook his frailty for holiness. He forced himself to sit long hours without moving, his legs screaming in pain, his back aching. But rather than softening into stillness, he clenched harder, convinced that suffering itself was the key. Sometimes he gazed at the older monks, their faces calm, their movements gentle, and he thought them weak, mistaking their quiet contentment for laziness. He told himself that he alone had the courage to press further, to endure more, to reach higher. Yet within, a shadow grew. The joy that had first led him to take the vows seemed distant now, replaced by a constant pressure that never let him rest. Even in dreams he chased visions of light, only to wake in darkness, heart pounding. Days stretched into weeks, and though his body obeyed his will, his spirit faltered, weighed down by exhaustion. In the garden one afternoon, as he hauled water for the plants, his arms trembling from hunger, he caught sight of a fellow novice smiling as the cool water splashed against his face. That smile was pure, unforced, born of simple delight, and in that instant the young monk felt a sting of jealousy, for he could not remember when he last felt such ease. He scolded himself at once, telling his heart to harden, to ignore such weakness, for joy would come only after victory. And yet the memory of that smile lingered, like a soft light flickering at the edge of his thoughts. The training continued. He memorized verses by candlelight, repeating them until his voice cracked, not out of reverence, but out of a thirst to recite more than the others. He took pride in knowing longer passages, in bowing lower, in sitting straighter. But each achievement dissolved quickly, leaving only the need for another. His ambition was a cup that could never be filled, no matter how much effort he poured into it. And slowly, silently, the cost began to show. His hands grew thin, his eyes hollow, and though he smiled when spoken to, the warmth behind it had faded. The abbot watched, but said nothing, letting the current of experience shape the lesson that no words could teach. The young monk did not yet see that his path had curved away from freedom and into a prison built by his own striving. Each evening, when the gongs signaled rest, the monastery softened into a hush of crickets and rustling leaves. The elder monks lay down in quiet contentment, their breath deep and steady. But the young monk remained awake, pacing the stone corridors, whispering sutras under his breath, as though repeating them faster would burn them deeper into his soul. He mistook rest for weakness, silence for idleness, and so he denied himself both. But the body, unlike ambition, has limits. And one night, as he sat forcing his eyes open against the pull of sleep, his body swayed and he collapsed in the stillness of the hall. Others carried him gently to his bed, their faces calm, not judging, not mocking, for they knew the weight of youthful fire and the toll it demanded. When he awoke the next morning, weak and trembling, shame flushed through him. Yet still he clung to the thought that he must try harder, must not falter. He told himself the fainting was a sign of progress, proof that he was pressing closer to the edge where awakening must surely wait. And so he returned to his harsh ways, though the seeds of doubt had been planted. Seeds that in time would grow into questions he could no longer ignore. In those early days of harsh training, he believed himself to be racing toward the summit. Yet in truth, he was circling in the foothills, chasing shadows of greatness while the path to peace lay quietly beneath his feet, waiting for him to notice. But notice he did not yet. For the fire of ambition still burned too fiercely, carrying him deeper into struggle, farther from the gentle truth that all along the way had been whispering to him in the laughter of children, the smiles of brothers, the song of the wind through the pines, a truth that could only be heard once he learned to let go. The days at the monastery followed one another with quiet rhythm, the ringing of the bell at dawn, the gathering for chanting, the work in the gardens, the study of scriptures, the stillness of meditation, and then the rest that fell with night. For most of the monks, this rhythm was like a gentle tide, carrying them steadily and calmly. But for the young monk, it became a stage upon which his mind played endless comparisons. His eyes grew restless, measuring each brother not as a companion but as a rival. When he saw another monk sit in meditation without moving for long hours, a seed of envy sprouted, whispering that he too must sit longer, that he must appear stronger, that he must surpass. When one of the novices recited verses with a clear, ringing voice, he burned within, hurriedly memorizing more lines, pushing his mind until words blurred together. Yet still he was never satisfied, for there was always another who seemed more natural, more at ease. His ambition no longer drove him only against himself. It turned outward, weaving comparisons into every glance, every sound, every movement of those around him. Slowly he began to withdraw, not into solitude for reflection, but into a guarded silence, afraid to reveal weakness, afraid that others might be praised in his place. He smiled politely, but behind that smile his heart tightened. In the communal meals he noticed who ate with grace, who bowed with sincerity, and he judged them in secret, telling himself that their actions were shallow, while his own hidden struggle was deeper. Yet when no one was looking, doubt would pierce him, and he wondered if perhaps it was they who walked rightly and he who strayed. In these moments of doubt he felt a sting of shame, but rather than yielding, he clung tighter to ambition, vowing to outdo them, to erase the shame with triumph. This constant gaze of comparison poisoned even the sweetest moments. When the blossoms of the orchard trees filled the courtyard with fragrance, the young monk felt little joy, for his eyes were fixed on whether another monk seemed more serene beneath their shade. When the river near the monastery sparkled under sunlight, he thought not of the beauty but of how his brothers might use such calmness to deepen their practice before he could. The world that had once seemed wide and filled with wonder narrowed into a mirror of competition, reflecting only his fears of falling behind. Rivalry grew silently in his heart, though no words of hostility left his mouth. It showed instead in the stiffness of his bow, in the tension of his shoulders, in the hollow tone of his chanting. Some of the elder monks noticed, but said nothing, knowing that a struggle unseen must unfold until its own weight became unbearable. The abbot, in his quiet wisdom, watched with gentle eyes, neither correcting nor condoning, for he understood that lessons rooted in experience flower deeper than lessons spoken aloud. One afternoon, as the sun leaned westward and the shadows grew long, the young monk was assigned to study with another novice close to his age. They sat together with scriptures laid before them, and the other novice, with a calm and patient voice, explained a passage with clarity that struck the young monk sharply. The explanation was simple, yet it carried the weight of genuine understanding. Envy swelled immediately. His heart raced, not because of the teaching itself, but because another had spoken it so well. Rather than absorbing the wisdom, he burned with the thought that he should have said it first, that he should be the one admired. He answered quickly, rushing to display his own knowledge. But his words tumbled clumsily, lacking the stillness that gave the other's speech such strength. His companion smiled kindly, not noticing the storm within him. And this kindness cut deeper than any insult, for it revealed no rivalry in return. That night, the young monk lay awake, replaying the exchange, feeling as though he had lost a battle that no one else even recognized. Comparison had become his silent tormentor, chaining his peace, stealing his sleep. Day after day, this pattern deepened. Each act of another became a measure against himself. Each praise given to another monk felt like a wound to his pride, though no word of malice ever passed his lips. Inwardly he was consumed, outwardly he appeared diligent, and this dissonance gnawed at him. Sometimes he wondered why the path that promised freedom seemed only to tighten his chains. But before the thought could settle, he drowned it with fresh vows to strive harder. In the still hours of night, when the monastery grew quiet and the stars spread their patient light, he would sit alone in the hall, staring at the statues of the Buddhas. Their faces, serene and untroubled, seemed distant from his burning turmoil. He whispered to himself that one day he too would wear such serenity, but not yet. Not until he had proven himself greater than all others. And so the gaze of comparison sharpened, and rivalry deepened its roots, wrapping around his heart like creeping vines. Though unseen by most, it drained him silently, leaving him weary, restless, unable to find the peace that had once drawn him to the path. In truth, he was not battling others, but only his own reflection. Yet this truth had not yet dawned upon him. The time would come when the weight of this rivalry would press too heavily to bear, and only then would the seeds of transformation stir. But for now, in these early chapters of his journey, the young monk lived bound by the invisible chains of comparison, his eyes always looking outward, never inward, and so his heart wandered further from the very stillness he sought. The nights in the monastery were meant to be a gift of silence, a time when the chanting had faded into memory, when the lamps burned softly, and when the air was filled only with the chorus of crickets and the sigh of the wind through the trees. For most monks, it was a time of gentle rest, their bodies lying still on the simple mats, their breaths deep and unbroken, their minds sinking into quiet dreams like lotus petals floating on calm waters. But for the young monk, the nights became a battlefield where his ambition clashed with his need for peace. As the stars spread across the heavens and the moonlight spilled across the courtyard, he would lie awake, eyes wide, heart restless, listening to the steady breathing of his brothers all around him. Each sigh, each shift of a body beside him, seemed to mock his inability to surrender to sleep. His thoughts chased one another endlessly, circling like moths around a flame. He asked himself why, after so much effort, enlightenment remained distant. He recited verses silently, hoping they might calm his spirit, but they only stirred more striving. He counted his breaths until numbers lost meaning, then clenched his jaw, frustrated that stillness eluded him. The longer he stayed awake, the sharper the ache of failure grew. He began to dread the coming of night, for darkness meant facing the storm within, facing the truth that all his efforts had not brought him closer to peace, but had only thickened the clouds of unrest. Some nights he rose quietly, pacing the stone corridors, whispering sutras under his breath. He convinced himself that wakefulness was a sign of dedication. that others slept because they lacked his burning drive. Yet deep down he knew it was not discipline, but torment that kept him awake. He told himself he was strong, but his body trembled with weariness, his eyes burned, and each step grew heavier. When dawn bells rang, he returned to the hall with a forced smile, bowing with the others, but inside he carried the heaviness of exhaustion. He looked at the serene faces of his fellow monks, radiant with the freshness of rest, and envy coiled in his chest once more. He thought them blessed with an ease denied to him, yet he could not see that their ease came not from striving but from letting go. The cycle deepened. Sleeplessness bred more frustration, and frustration bred more sleeplessness, until he found himself trapped in long nights of silent suffering. Even when his eyes closed, dreams carried the same restlessness, filled with images of climbing mountains only to find no summit, chasing lights that dissolved into shadows, reaching for crowns that slipped through his fingers. He would wake with a start, breath quick, sweat damp upon his brow, and the calm of the monastery seemed a distant world from his inner storm. During the day, his body showed the marks of sleeplessness. His hands shook when lifting bowls, his step faltered when walking the paths, his voice grew hoarse when chanting. Yet still he pressed on, hiding his fatigue behind layers of pride, unwilling to admit weakness, unwilling to surrender his dream of surpassing others. The abbot observed quietly, never rebuking, never comforting with easy words, for he knew that the young monk's heart must reach its own breaking point. Sometimes he would pass by the young monk late at night, seeing him sit rigid and pale beneath the lantern glow, eyes burning with both longing and exhaustion. The abbot's gaze was soft, filled with compassion, but he did not speak, for words cannot heal what experience alone must unravel. And so the young monk continued, caught between ambition and despair, unable to rest, unable to find the peace that had once drawn him to the path. One evening, after many nights without sleep, he stumbled to the meditation hall and sat cross-legged as usual. His body sagged with fatigue, his mind fogged with exhaustion, yet he forced himself upright, determined to appear steady. The hall was quiet, the air thick with incense, the statues of the Buddhas glowing in the dim light. He closed his eyes, commanded his breath too slow, but his body rebelled. His legs twitched, his back ached, his head drooped forward. He snapped it upright, biting his lip, scolding himself to endure. Moments later, it fell again, heavier this time. Finally, his body gave way, and he toppled sideways, collapsing onto the cold stone floor. When he awoke, gentle hands were lifting him, carrying him back to his mat. He glimpsed the faces of his brothers, not mocking but tender eyes filled with concern. They laid him down carefully, and one novice placed a folded cloth beneath his head. The young monk wanted to protest, to insist that he needed no help, that he was stronger than they knew, but the words caught in his throat. Exhaustion silenced his pride, and for a fleeting moment, as he drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, he tasted the sweetness of surrender, the rest that comes only when effort ceases. Yet by morning, his old fire returned. He told himself the collapse was a weakness, a momentary failure he must erase with greater effort. He vowed to train harder, to meditate longer, to sleep less, believing still that victory lay in pushing beyond limits. And so the cycle began anew, nights of restlessness, days of weariness, ambition tightening its grip with each passing season. The once bright path of the Dharma grew shadowed in his eyes, not because the truth had dimmed, but because his own striving had clouded it. He did not yet see that the peace he longed for could not be forced, that sleeplessness was not a sign of dedication but a cry of imbalance. That comparison and ambition had turned his noble vows into chains. All this he would learn in time, but in these restless nights he remained blind, running endlessly within his own mind, chasing dreams that dissolved like mist at dawn. And the monastery, with its patient walls and timeless trees, held him gently through it all, waiting for the moment when his heart would finally grow weary enough to listen. The sun hung low over the monastery, painting the sky with shades of amber and rose, and the monks finished their evening tasks in silence. The young monk, weary from yet another day of strained effort and another night without true rest, walked with heavy steps to the hall where the abbot often received the novices for quiet conversations. He had not intended to seek counsel, for his pride still resisted the idea of appearing weak. But the exhaustion in his body and the storm in his mind weighed too heavily. As he reached the wooden doors, he hesitated, listening to the soft creak of the trees in the courtyard, then slowly pushed them open. Inside, the abbot sat in simple stillness, a small lamp burning beside him, the air fragrant with sandalwood. His eyes calm and bright despite their age, lifted to the young monk with a gaze that seemed to see not only his face but the turmoil hidden beneath. The young monk bowed deeply, his forehead touching the floor, and when he rose, his lips trembled with the urge to speak, yet no words came. The abbot gestured gently for him to sit, and so he folded his legs before the elder, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a long while there was only silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the lamp's flame. The young monk shifted, uneasy, for he was used to filling silence with striving, with effort, with words and thoughts. But the abbot's stillness pressed upon him like a mirror, reflecting his own restlessness back to him. At last, unable to bear the weight, the young monk spoke. His voice was low, strained, as he confessed his sleeplessness, his constant comparisons, his hunger to surpass, his shame at his own weakness. The words poured out in a rush, as though a dam had broken. And when he finished, he bowed his head, unable to meet the abbot's gaze. The elder monk listened without interruption, his expression unchanging, his presence steady like the earth itself. When the young monk's words faded into silence, the abbot finally spoke, his tones soft yet carrying a weight that seemed to settle deep into the heart. He said that ambition is a flame that burns not only what it touches, but also the one who carries it. He said that the path to awakening is not won by force, nor is it a race to be completed before others. He spoke of the tree that grows by the river, how it stretches not because it strives against its neighbors, but because it simply follows the nature of the sun and rain. The young monk listened, his eyes lowered, his chest tight with both resistance and longing. The abbot continued, saying that peace cannot be forced into the heart as a soldier forces entry into a gate. Peace comes like dawn, slowly, quietly, naturally, when the night has run its course. The more one grasps for it, the more it slips away, just as the tighter one clenches a handful of sand. The more quickly it escapes through the fingers. These words struck the young monk deeply, though his pride bristled. He wanted to protest, to argue that his ambition came from noble desire, from the wish to reach the truth swiftly. But as he opened his mouth, the abbot raised a gentle hand, and the protest faded into silence. The elder's eyes held a kindness that was both firm and tender, a kindness that offered no room for excuses, yet gave no wound of judgment. He told the young monk that the Buddha himself did not awaken through ambition, but through release, through letting go of striving after countless failures. He reminded him of the story of the Bodhisattva who starved himself in harsh asceticism, who pushed his body beyond endurance, only to find that wisdom did not arise in torment but in the middle way, balanced, steady, free from extremes. The young monk's breath caught at these words, for he saw his own reflection in that story, his own exhaustion mirrored in the Bodhisattva's despair. For the first time he wondered if perhaps his endless effort was not strength but delusion, not devotion but a trap. The abbot's voice softened further, telling him that even now the doorway to peace was near, nearer than his own breath. If only he would unclench his fist, loosen his heart, and stop chasing what cannot be chased. He spoke of sleep as a teacher, showing that rest comes not by command but by surrender, just as peace comes not by grasping but by letting go. Then silence returned, the abbot's eyes closing as he folded his hands in his lap. The young monk sat frozen, the elder's words echoing within him like bells. He felt both exposed and relieved, as if a great weight had been named, though not yet lifted. When he finally bowed and left the hall, the night air felt different upon his skin, cooler, softer, though his heart still wrestled with doubt. He walked to his mat and lay down, eyes open to the ceiling, wondering if he could truly let go, if he dared to release the ambition that had driven him so fiercely. The crickets sang, the wind sighed, his brothers slept peacefully around him. He turned from side to side, half afraid that surrender would mean failure, half longing for the ease it promised. Sleep came only in fragments, but within those brief dreams he felt a flicker of gentleness, as if the abbot's words had planted a seed that would grow in time. The days that followed did not erase his ambition, for old habits cling tightly, but something within him had shifted. When he saw another monk praised, the sting of comparison still rose, but beneath it was a whisper that reminded him of the tree by the river, of the dawn that comes without striving. When he forced himself to sit beyond his body's strength, a memory surfaced of the Bodhisattva fainting beneath the tree of asceticism, and he loosened his posture slightly, uncertain yet curious about this middle way. The abbot said little more, leaving the young monk to wrestle with his own heart, for wisdom cannot be handed from one to another. It must ripen within, and so the young monk walked between two voices, one, the old voice of ambition, sharp and insistent, urging him to push harder, to prove himself. The other, the new voice of gentleness, soft and patient, urging him to release, to rest, to trust in the unfolding of the path. Each day was a struggle between these two, and though the old voice was louder, the new one lingered, steady as a seed beneath the soil waiting for rain. He did not know then how long it would take, nor how many trials still lay before him. But the lesson of the abbot had been planted in his heart, and though buried beneath layers of pride and fear, it would in time grow into a strength far greater than ambition could ever yield. For the first time since taking his vows, the young monk glimpsed the possibility that peace was not a crown to be seized, but a gift to be received, not through victory but through surrender, not through being more than others but through being simply what he was. And though he still turned restlessly in the night, though his mind still measured and compared, though his pride still flared, a crack had opened in the walls he had built around himself. Through that crack the light of wisdom began to enter, faint yet steady, promising that one day, when he was ready, he would find what he had sought all along, not by striving higher, but by bowing lower, not by adding more, but by letting go. The seasons shifted once more, and the air around the monastery grew heavy with the stillness of late summer, when the rains had nourished the earth and the fields beyond the hills ripened with grain. The days passed in the familiar rhythm of chanting, work, meditation, and rest. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet unease stirred among the monks. For news began to drift from the villagers that hardship was approaching. Crops had withered in places where the rains fell unevenly, and hunger pressed upon the families who lived close to the monastery walls. One morning, as the monks walked barefoot in their alms round through the village lanes, the young monk noticed how few bowls were filled, how many doors remained closed, how many eyes lowered with shame as they whispered that they had nothing to give. The line of monks walked silently, accepting whatever little was offered. Yet the young monk felt a tightening in his chest, for he had been so consumed with his own striving that he had scarcely noticed the suffering beyond the temple walls. When they returned to the monastery with only a handful of rice and vegetables, the brothers shared equally without complaint. But hunger grew in their eyes as days turned into weeks. The abbot announced calmly that the monks would continue their practice with gratitude for whatever nourishment was received, and that hardship was itself a teacher, showing the impermanence of all conditions. The young monk listened, but inwardly he trembled, for his body was already weakened by months of restless striving and sleepless nights. Each step felt heavier, each breath shorter, and now the scarcity of food deepened his exhaustion. Still, he forced himself to sit long in meditation, determined to prove his endurance. Though his vision blurred and his heart raced, one evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, the abbot gathered the monks in the courtyard and spoke of the coming trial. He said that famine would test not only their bodies, but their hearts, that compassion must grow even when the belly was empty, that the path of the Dharma shines brightest in darkness. His words carried no fear, only steady clarity, yet they sank into the young monk like stones. He thought of himself not as a vessel of compassion, but as a fragile shell, cracked and trembling, unsure if he could withstand what lay ahead. That night, he lay awake once more, listening to the hollow growl of his stomach, the whispers of doubt louder than ever. He dreamed of food, dreamed of feasts, dreamed of being strong and admired while others faltered. Yet each dream dissolved into the taste of emptiness, and he awoke with bitterness on his tongue. The days grew harder. Some monks fainted during their work, others grew pale and thin, yet their eyes remained calm, their lips still soft with kindness. The young monk watched with confusion, for though he too grew weak, his mind raged against the hunger, cursing his fate, longing for escape. His old ambition twisted itself into new shapes, whispering that if he could endure this trial better than the others, he would be praised, remembered, elevated. He tried to walk taller, though his body ached, tried to chant louder, though his voice cracked, tried to meditate longer, though his head spun with dizziness. But one afternoon, as the monks worked in the garden, his legs finally gave way and he collapsed upon the soil. Darkness closed in around him, and when he awoke he found himself lying in the shade of a tree, a bowl of water at his side, placed there by one of the novices. The boy sat quietly nearby, humming a tune as simple as the flow of a stream. Not looking for thanks, not expecting praise, simply content to sit and watch over him. The young monk felt a rush of shame, for he realized that while his mind had been filled with rivalry and ambition, this child had given what he could without thought of himself. That small act pierced him deeper than hunger, stirring a recognition he could not yet name. The famine pressed on. Each day became a trial of body and spirit, stripping away pride, stripping away illusions. The young monk grew thinner, his ambition flickering between defiance and despair. Sometimes he felt ready to surrender, to walk away, to abandon the path altogether. Yet something kept him rooted, perhaps the memory of the abbot's eyes, perhaps the quiet strength of his brothers, perhaps the faint whisper of truth within his own heart. One evening, as he struggled through meditation, sweat damp upon his skin, he suddenly felt as if his body would dissolve. His breath grew ragged, his chest burned, and his mind screamed with both fear and longing. He opened his eyes and saw the rows of monks sitting still, their faces serene though their bodies were as frail as his. He wanted to cry out, to demand how they could remain so calm, how they could find peace amid suffering, yet no voice came. Instead, he lowered his gaze and for the first time allowed himself to admit his weakness, allowed himself to feel the depth of his exhaustion without resistance. In that moment, something shifted. The hunger did not leave, the weakness did not vanish. Yet the rage that had fueled his ambition softened slightly, like a knot loosening by a single thread. He remembered the abbot's words, that peace cannot be forced, that rest comes only through surrender, and he wondered if perhaps this trial was not a curse but a teacher, stripping him of all illusions until only truth remained. The night air wrapped around him gently, carrying the scent of the earth and the distant song of the river. For the first time in many months, he did not fight against the silence, but allowed it to seep into him, fragile and incomplete though his surrender was. He closed his eyes, not in defiance but in weariness, and drifted into a sleep unmarked by dreams. The great trial had arrived, and it had broken much within him. Yet within that breaking, the first fragile glimmer of release had begun to shine. The famine stretched on, and the air grew heavy with weariness. Yet in the monastery there remained a strange, quiet strength, as though beneath the hunger there was a deeper current carrying the monks forward. Each day they walked to the village, bowls in hand, and each day they returned with little or nothing, yet still they bowed with gratitude. Still they shared equally. Still they chanted with voices thin but steady. The young monk followed among them, his steps faltering, his mind a tangle of despair and pride. He felt himself shrinking, his ambition dimming, yet he clung to what little remained, telling himself that if he could endure this trial longer than others, then surely he would prove his worth. Yet the hunger carved him hollow, and his nights were restless, filled with dreams of food he could not taste, and visions of strength that dissolved each time he reached for them. One morning, as the monks walked barefoot along the dusty road, the young monk stumbled and nearly fell. A farmer who stood by his field saw him and rushed forward, placing in his bowl a small bundle of roots. The young monk looked up, surprised, for the man's face was gaunt, his own family thin behind him, yet still he offered what little he had. The young monk bowed low, tears pricking his eyes, for he realized that even in hardship generosity could blossom, that compassion was not bound by abundance but by the heart. As they returned to the monastery, other villagers began to appear along the path, some with a handful of rice, some with fruit, some with nothing more than a smile and a prayer. Word had spread of the monks' endurance, of their calm amid suffering, and the villagers felt moved to give what they could, even in scarcity. The young monk watched in silence, his heart stirring with something unfamiliar, a softness he had long ignored. He realized that help had come not through his striving, not through his ambition, but through the natural flow of compassion awakened in others. That evening the abbot spoke to the monks, his voice gentle but firm, saying that suffering is not endured alone, that when hearts remain open, the world itself becomes a companion. That help often arrives not when demanded, but when welcomed with humility. The young monk sat quietly, his body weak, yet his heart strangely light. He thought of all his months of restless striving, of nights spent forcing his breath, of days consumed with rivalry, and he saw how none of it had brought him closer to peace. Yet here, in the simple act of a farmer giving roots, he felt something shift, as though a door long closed had opened a crack. The next day he rose before dawn and walked to the village again. This time, instead of letting his eyes burn with comparison or pride, he lifted them gently to the faces around him. He saw the lines of hardship on the villagers' brows, the quiet determination in their steps, the love in the way mothers held their children, the kindness in the way strangers greeted one another. For the first time he felt connected to them, not as someone striving to be above, but as someone sharing the same fragile breath of life. As he returned to the monastery, he noticed how the light touched the trees, how the wind moved softly through the leaves, how the world seemed both fragile and vast. It was as if his senses had awakened, not with the sharpness of ambition, but with the gentleness of presence. That night, though hunger still gnawed at him, he lay upon his mat and breathed more easily. He remembered the farmer's gift, the villagers' smiles, the abbot's words, and he felt a warmth in his chest that eased the ache of emptiness. For the first time in many months, he drifted into sleep without struggle, carried not by victory but by surrender, not by superiority but by gratitude. The famine did not end quickly, and there were still long days of weakness and quiet endurance. Yet help continued to arrive in unexpected ways. Sometimes a traveler brought dried fruit, sometimes a child carried water, sometimes a stranger offered a song or a prayer. Each gift was small, yet together they became a stream that sustained the monastery. And with each act of kindness, the young monk felt his heart soften further. He began to see that greatness was not found in surpassing others, but in receiving with humility, in giving with sincerity, in walking together through hardship. His ambition still whispered at times, urging him to prove himself, but its voice grew fainter, drowned out by the gentler song of compassion that now stirred within him. One evening, as the monks sat together beneath the stars, sharing a small meal of rice and roots, the young monk looked around at their thin yet peaceful faces and felt a deep stillness settle within him. He realized that help had arrived not only from outside but also from within, that the trial had broken him open so that compassion could enter. For the first time he no longer feared his weakness, for he saw that it was through weakness that he had learned to receive, through emptiness that he had learned to be filled. And so, in the midst of famine, surrounded by hardship, the young monk discovered a fragile but real peace. A peace born not from ambition but from connection, not from striving but from surrender, not from victory but from the simple grace of help that arrives when the heart is ready to receive. The famine lingered, though its sharpest teeth had dulled with the slow trickle of kindness flowing in from the surrounding villages. The monks endured, their bodies lean but their spirits steadier now, for they had learned to walk with hardship rather than against it. Yet not everyone bore the season with grace. Beyond the walls of the monastery, there were those who saw the hunger of others not as a call to compassion, but as an opportunity to grasp more for themselves. Among the villagers was a landowner who held wide fields and full granaries, and while his neighbors thinned with want, he hoarded his stores, locking them away behind barred doors, selling only at cruel prices to those desperate enough to give up what little they had. His eyes, once warm, had grown hard with greed, and he walked the lanes with the pride of one who believed himself above suffering. The monks passed his house on their alms rounds, and each time the landowner shook his head, saying he had nothing to spare, though the scent of stored grain drifted faintly from within. The young monk, carrying his bowl, felt bitterness rise when he saw such selfishness. For he had begun to understand how even the smallest act of generosity could sustain life, and he could not fathom how a man with so much could give nothing. Yet the abbot bowed each time, his face calm, his heart unshaken, and the line of monks continued in silence. Weeks passed, and the landowner's wealth grew even as the famine deepened. But greed is a fire that consumes itself, and soon whispers spread through the village. Those who once respected him began to turn away. Those who once sought his favor now muttered curses under their breath. His riches did not shield him from loneliness, and his granaries, though full, became a prison. One night, a band of desperate men crept to his fields, taking what they could under cover of darkness. When the landowner discovered the theft, rage blinded him, yet no amount of anger could restore the grain. Fear followed rage, for he realized that he had surrounded himself with enemies, that his hoarded wealth had become a beacon for resentment. The young monk heard of this through the villagers, and though part of him felt a grim satisfaction, another part remembered the abbot's words that suffering arises not only from poverty but from attachment, and that greed is its own famine, devouring the heart even when the belly is full. Soon after, the landowner fell ill. His body, once strong, weakened as worry consumed him. Alone in his house, he clutched at his stores as though they might save him. Yet no grain could ease the fever, no coin could cool his burning skin. The villagers, remembering his cruelty, turned away, and even his servants abandoned him. Only silence and shadows kept him company. One evening, as the monks walked through the village, word came that the landowner was dying. The abbot, without hesitation, turned his steps toward the man's house, the young monk following reluctantly. They entered the dim chamber where the landowner lay, eyes sunken, breath shallow. He looked upon them with a mixture of fear and longing, as though seeing in their robes the peace he had never known. The abbot sat beside him, placing a cool cloth upon his brow, speaking softly of compassion and letting go. The young monk stood at a distance, his heart torn between anger at the man's greed and pity for his suffering. As the hours passed, the landowner wept, confessing that his wealth had brought him nothing but isolation, that his hunger for more had left him emptier than the poorest beggar. The abbot listened without judgment, his presence like a steady flame in the darkness. At last the landowner's breath slowed, and with trembling hands he whispered a plea for forgiveness. The abbot bowed his head, offering words of peace, and the man's eyes closed for the final time. The room grew still, and the silence that followed was heavy with both sorrow and release. The monks left quietly, and the young monk walked behind the abbot, his mind filled with questions. He thought of his own ambition, of the way he had clung to recognition, of the sleepless nights spent chasing superiority. Though his hunger had not been for grain, it was still a hunger that consumed, still a greed that hollowed the heart. He realized that in the landowner's fall he saw a reflection of his own path, that if he continued to clutch at ambition, he too would end alone, imprisoned by his own craving. That night he lay awake, not with the restlessness of pride, but with the stirring of realization. The face of the dying man haunted him, and he felt both sorrow and warning in its lines. He whispered to himself that greatness is not measured by what one holds, but by what one gives, not by the weight of possessions or the height of ambition, but by the depth of compassion and the ease of letting go. For the first time he did not fear his weakness, for he saw that weakness can be the ground from which humility grows. Sleep came slowly, yet when it arrived it was gentle, and his dreams were no longer of crowns and victories, but of open hands releasing what they once clutched so tightly. The fall of the greedy had become his lesson, and though he did not yet know how fully it would shape him, he felt that a turning had begun, that the path before him was slowly bending away from ambition and toward a peace he had only glimpsed from afar. The days after the landowner's death passed with a stillness that seemed to hang in the air like a long breath held by the earth itself. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of his fate, some with pity, others with bitterness, but all with the understanding that greed had consumed him more thoroughly than hunger ever could. Within the monastery, the young monk carried the memory of that dim chamber in his heart, the image of the man clinging to wealth even as life slipped from his grasp. It was a mirror he could not look away from, for he saw in it the shadow of his own ambition, the restless hunger that had driven him through sleepless nights and endless striving. He began to walk differently through the days, no longer with the hurried steps of one chasing victory, but with slower movements, as though each step carried the weight of reflection. His body remained weak, for the famine had not yet ended, but in his weakness there was a new kind of awareness. When his stomach ached with emptiness, he noticed how the pain rose and fell like waves, and instead of raging against it, he allowed it to pass through him, teaching him the impermanence of all things. When envy stirred as another monk received praise for a kind act, he breathed into the feeling, watching how it burned hot at first, then cooled into ash when not fed. The suffering that once drove him to anger now became a teacher, quiet but persistent, showing him truths he had long ignored. One afternoon he sat by the river that wound its way past the monastery, its waters low from the dry season yet still flowing steadily. He watched the current twist around rocks, softening their sharp edges little by little, and in that gentle persistence he saw a reflection of the Dharma. The river did not strive, did not rush to surpass the mountains or compete with the wind. It simply flowed, and in its flowing it shaped the land, nourished the fields, gave life to all it touched. He thought of his own restless ambition and saw how unlike the river he had been, how he had tried to force his way forward, to cut through obstacles with pride instead of patience. Tears welled in his eyes as he realized that his suffering had not been punishment but guidance, steering him back toward the current he had resisted. That evening, during meditation, his body still ached and his thoughts still wandered, but he did not scold himself as before. He let the aches be, let the thoughts drift, and for the first time in many months, a soft stillness settled over him, fragile yet real, like the first light of dawn breaking through a long night. The abbot, seated at the front of the hall, opened his eyes and glanced at him, and though no words were spoken, the young monk felt as if the elder had seen into his heart and smiled. The famine dragged on, but the young monk now carried it differently. He no longer cursed his hunger nor envied the fullness of others. Instead, he shared what little strength he had with the weaker novices, offering a shoulder when they faltered, carrying water when their legs trembled, whispering encouragement when despair clouded their eyes. In giving of himself, he discovered a strange paradox. The more he gave, the lighter his own burden felt. The emptiness in his belly remained, but his heart felt fuller than it had ever been when driven by ambition. The villagers too noticed the change. Where once he had walked with eyes sharp and distant, now his gaze was gentle, meeting theirs with warmth. They began to approach him not with fear of pride, but with trust, sharing their stories, their worries, their small joys amid hardship. He listened without judgment, and in listening he found that compassion was not something to be claimed, but something to be practiced, moment by moment, breath by breath. One evening, a child from the village approached him, offering a single piece of fruit. The child's face was thin, but his eyes shone with brightness. The young monk accepted the gift with both hands, bowing low, and then broke the fruit in half, giving the larger piece back to the child. The boy laughed, delighted, and the sound of his laughter echoed in the young monk's heart long into the night. He realized then that true greatness was not found in surpassing others, but in sharing joy, in easing another's burden, in living with open hands rather than clenched fists. His suffering had opened this door, carving away his pride until compassion could enter, teaching him that pain itself can be a teacher if one is willing to listen. As the months wore on, the famine slowly eased. Rains returned, crops began to grow again, and the villagers' faces softened with relief. The monastery too found its bowls filling more steadily, and the monks regained some strength. But for the young monk, the greatest change had already taken place within. The sleepless nights that once tormented him gave way to rest, not because his body was stronger, but because his heart no longer burned with rivalry. He no longer measured his worth by how still he sat or how quickly he learned, but by how gently he could breathe, how kindly he could act. One night he lay upon his mat, listening to the wind stir through the trees, and for the first time he felt no struggle, no striving, only gratitude. He closed his eyes and surrendered to sleep as naturally as a leaf drifting upon water. The suffering had not broken him. It had awakened him. Through hunger he had learned contentment. Through weakness he had discovered compassion. Through rivalry he had found humility. He understood now that the path to peace is not paved with ambition but with surrender, not with victory but with kindness. And as he drifted into dreams, he felt a quiet joy that needed no witness, no recognition, no crown, only the simple truth that in letting go he had found what he had sought all along. Seasons turned once more, and the monastery slowly returned to its familiar rhythm as the famine loosened its grip on the land. The fields beyond the hills brightened again with green shoots. The rivers swelled with clear water, and the villagers' faces softened with relief as harvests began to return. Laughter returned to the courtyards where once silence had lingered heavy, and the monks carried their bowls through the lanes with lighter steps, receiving rice and fruit once more from grateful hands. Yet within the young monk, a transformation had already taken root, far deeper than the change of seasons. He was no longer driven by the restless fire that had once consumed him, nor haunted by the sleepless ambition that had chained him. Instead, his heart had grown quiet, like a pond cleared of storms, reflecting the sky without distortion. He carried his tasks with the same care as before, sweeping the courtyard, chanting with the community, tending to the gardens, yet his mind was different, no longer chasing recognition, no longer comparing. When others spoke with wisdom, he listened with genuine joy rather than envy. When others sat in long stillness, he admired their peace rather than rushing to match it. What had once been rivalry had dissolved into companionship, and what had once been hunger for greatness had become gratitude for simplicity. The abbot noticed the change, though he said little. His eyes, when they met the young monks, carried a quiet pride. Not the pride of superiority, but the pride of a teacher who sees a seed sprout after long patience. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the clouds in gold, the abbot called the young monk to sit beside him beneath the great Bodhi tree that shaded the monastery courtyard. The air was still, carrying only the soft rustle of leaves. The abbot spoke slowly, asking the young monk what he had learned through the hardships he had endured. The young monk bowed his head, his voice trembling with humility, and said that he had learned ambition is a fire that burns not only the one who carries it, but all that it touches. That sleepless striving brings only exhaustion, while surrender brings peace. That compassion fills the emptiness that craving can never satisfy. He said he had seen how greed destroys, how generosity sustains, how suffering itself can awaken when met with patience, and above all, that true peace is not something to be seized, but something that blossoms naturally when the heart opens and lets go. The abbot listened with a gentle smile, nodding as though hearing not only the words, but the sincerity behind them. He told the young monk that these were not lessons taught by any teacher's tongue, but by life itself, that such lessons are carved into the heart and cannot be forgotten. He reminded him that the path of the Dharma is endless, that awakening is not a destination reached once and for all, but a continual deepening, a continual surrender, a continual softening of the heart. The young monk bowed deeply, tears in his eyes, for he understood now what he had not when he first arrived, that the robes he wore were not a crown of distinction, but a reminder of humility, that the path was not a race, but a journey walked together, that peace was not in becoming more, but in needing less. In the days that followed, he lived these truths quietly. When he arose before dawn, it was not to push harder than others, but to welcome the stillness of morning. When he ate his small meal, it was with gratitude rather than pride in restraint. When he worked beside the novices, it was with joy in their laughter rather than annoyance at their ease. And when he lay down to sleep, he no longer clenched his eyes in frustration, but let himself drift gently, trusting the night to carry him. The villagers too noticed the change. They spoke of the young monk not as the ambitious novice who had once seemed aloof, but as the gentle one whose presence calmed, whose words soothed, whose eyes reflected kindness. Children ran to him with questions, elders sought his counsel, and travelers paused to listen when he spoke softly of the lessons he had learned. He never claimed to be wise, never raised himself above others, but in his humility others saw the quiet strength that ambition had once hidden. The memory of the famine, the death of the greedy landowner, the sleepless nights, the collapse in the meditation hall, all became part of the story he carried, not with shame but with gratitude, for each moment of suffering had been a step toward awakening. He understood now that no trial is wasted when it is met with awareness, no hardship is meaningless when it is turned into compassion, no weakness is shameful when it opens the heart to others. Years later, when the young monk had grown older, he often sat beneath the same Bodhi tree where the abbot had once spoken to him, and he shared his story with the novices who came with questions of their own. He told them not to fear their struggles, not to despise their weakness, not to rush their path. He told them that ambition may rise like a storm, but that storms always pass, that suffering may burn like fire, but that fire can also illuminate, that the path of letting go is the only path that truly leads to peace. Some nights he would sit alone, gazing at the stars, remembering the restless boy he had once been, and he would smile with tenderness, for he no longer judged that boy harshly. He understood that even ambition had played its part, pushing him into the experiences that revealed its own futility. In the end, everything had been a teacher, everything had led him here. And so the eternal lesson remained, that peace is not found in striving, not in rivalry, not in clinging to greatness, but in the gentle act of release, in the quiet practice of compassion, in the simple trust of each breath. It is a lesson that cannot be forced upon another, but must be lived, tasted, suffered, and embraced. The young monk, now ripened by years, lived it with every step, every word, every smile. And though the seasons continued to turn, though hardship and ease came and went, though life unfolded with all its impermanence, the lesson did not fade, For once learned, it became the very rhythm of his heart. The monastery walls held his story, the villagers carried it in their whispers, and the wind through the trees seemed to echo it for all who would listen. The eternal lesson was not his alone, but belonged to all who walked the path, all who sought peace, all who were willing to let go. Every story carries with it not just the echo of events, but the deeper thread of meaning, the quiet truth that waits beneath the surface of suffering and joy. The journey of the young monk who burned with ambition and wrestled through sleepless nights, who stumbled beneath the weight of hunger and pride, who witnessed the fall of greed and the rise of compassion, is not only his story, but a mirror for all of us. We may not wear robes or walk through monastery courtyards, yet in our own ways we too carry the restless fire of wanting to be more, to be seen, to be greater. We too know the fatigue that comes when ambition drives us harder than the heart can bear. But just as the young monk discovered, there is a gentler way waiting to be found, a way that does not demand victory but invites release, a way that does not ask us to climb higher but to soften where we are. Suffering itself becomes the teacher when we allow it to show us impermanence, to reveal the futility of grasping, to open the door to compassion. The sleepless nights that once tormented the young monk became the soil in which peace finally blossomed. His weakness became his strength, his failures became his wisdom, and his surrender became his awakening. The lesson is eternal and simple. True peace does not come by holding tighter, but by letting go. Not by surpassing others, but by walking gently beside them. Not by filling ourselves, but by opening our hands. In listening to his story, may you too feel the soft reminder that you need not strive so fiercely to be worthy. That rest is not found at the finish line of ambition, but in the quiet acceptance of this very moment. As you close your eyes and drift into sleep, let the story linger like a lullaby, carrying you into dreams that are free of rivalry, free of grasping, filled only with the gentle rhythm of your own breath. And if this tale has brought you comfort, if its stillness has touched your night, I invite you to stay with us on this journey. There are many more stories waiting, stories of compassion, of wisdom, of release. Each one a gentle hand guiding you toward rest. Subscribe to Buddhism for sleep, and let these timeless teachings accompany you night after night, softening your heart, easing your mind, and carrying you into peace.